First, I need to tell you about this perfect moment that Carrie and I had before we had children, where we had a sense of control about who our kids would be. See, Carrie and I, we adopted through foster care, and as a part of the application, we filled out a questionnaire about which kids we would and would not accept. Age, race, drug exposure, various medical conditions, and a great variety of behaviors to choose from. All of these were options for us to consider. Could we parent kids that did that? Or were like that? Or came from that? 17 and a half years into parenting, I recognized that this whole thing was obviously a fantasy. Mostly because being a parent is an experience of just finally figuring out how to parent your kid just in time for them to completely change. And also, of course, for kids coming from foster care, which is to say coming from trauma, it is important to think seriously about these questions. Because even though I do believe that love wins in an ultimate sense, I have also come to understand that love cannot fix everything. And so it's good that they ask you to get honest about your own limits. The check boxes that required no conversation or getting honest, however, were the ones that were marked M and F. They didn't give us an option for NB or intersex for the record, but we would have checked those too. Like a lot of parents, we just wanted a kid, whatever their gender, and actually as queer identified feminists, we weren't sure how much these early on designations even mattered. We would be raising our kids without traditional notions of gender, since gender is, after all, a social construct. For this reason, when our son Joseph arrived, when our daughter Gracie was 2.5, we did not make a concerted effort to go out and buy so-called boy toys. Gracie had plenty of toys, we thought. She had books and dress-up items and all kind of stuff for imaginative play. These were obviously enough. We had like a whole room filled with toys, and toys don't have a gender. Joseph was in many ways a different baby than Gracie. First of all, he was a very good sleeper. She, not so much. He was easygoing, and unless he was overtired or hungry, he's just pretty flexible. I mean, he didn't seem to have any strong preferences. I mean, he did really like it when we'd pay attention to him. And we were always like, oh, what a typical second kid to set such low bar expectations for his parents. This impression of our son continued until he was just about a year old. Easygoing, no real strong preferences, not really excitable, not sad either. That is, until one day we took Joseph over to our friend's house to play. Our friends had 2 boys. They were exactly the same age as our kids, and they had every traditionally boy toy that exists. Monster trucks, trains, blocks, balls, a tool bench with tools, dinosaurs, and then all the books were about trucks and trains and blocks and balls. There were 0 dolls. No musical instruments, no puzzles, and no cooking station like we had at our place because remember, toys don't have a gender. So we walked into our friend's house and Joseph saw all of the toys and the trucks all over the floors, the train on the table, and literally in that instant he became a different kid. He started cheering. Ah! And making noises we'd never heard him make before. And he was saying what he had already told us. This was his first word, but he said it a lot. Ball. Yes, his first word was ball. I put him down, and he wasn't walking yet, so he just like scooched himself over faster than I've ever seen him move and started vrooming all the trucks and then the trains, choo-choo, and then he threw the ball, Carrie and I laughed so hard. We're like, Joseph, I guess we need to get you some different toys. Ball, he said, smiling. My relationship with boys and men and masculinity has always been, to a degree, confusing. I mean, I never had confusion about being a girl, or certainly didn't want to be one of the boys, but I was perpetually confused about why boys were given access to things that I was not. From leadership roles to athletic attention to pants. Literally, in my Catholic school, only boys were allowed to wear pants. It was a big conversation until about 3rd or 4th grade that I was in, and so they changed the policy at that point. Until then, it was jumper dresses, plaid, and polos and sweaters, and also, of course, shorts under those jumper dresses because boys like to flip the skirts up. Now, because I was raised Catholic, I took it as a given that men were in charge, even if it was also obvious to me that women were doing most of the actual work. Now, as a self-proclaimed math nerd, I spent a lot of time with boys, mostly white boys, growing up, my fellow math nerds, who all found me a tolerable addition to the otherwise all-boys math team and the Knowledge Bowl. I told you, nerd. At least I was tolerable as long as I didn't bring down our scores, which I didn't. I want to say to you that I thought the same about them, like I was tolerating them as long as they didn't bring down the scores, but I didn't. I knew my spot was contestable in ways that theirs was not. When my pre-calc teacher in junior year announced to the class one day that I was scary smart, I literally argued with him. I was like, no, Jason Zanone and Ron Belgau, they are scary smart. I just work hard. Somewhat relatedly, the first boy I really liked, he seemed from all appearances to like me back, but for some reason never seemed to make any moves. So finally I decided I was going to ask him what was going on, and he blurted out, "Boys don't want to have sex with girls like you." I spent so many hours trying to figure out what he meant by that. Like, what was wrong with me, even though in some weird way, I actually think he meant it as a compliment. Now, my parents were, for most of my growing up, traditional in their gender roles. My mom's primary labor was raising me and my 2 sisters, along with caring for our home and preparing food. And my dad's labor was his professional career as an architect. A job that brought him, as he would often report at the dinner table, in contact with different types of, and this is his word, so I'm taking a chance you'll tolerate it in a sermon, dicks. Yes, my dad, this is his word, my dad would spend a portion of most every family dinner telling us, reporting in from the day, about the book that he was going to write someday called Dicks. Each chapter, he said, would be a different sort of dick that shows up in a business meeting to sabotage the possibility of progress or collaboration. I hope it's clear by now, you seem to get it, that my dad wasn't really talking that his chapters would be describing literal anatomy, although it was his consistent and gleeful metaphor. It was his elaborate and, to us, highly entertaining explanation to his wife and his 2 daughters about what it was like to work in the world of men. Still, it wasn't until college that I started to get a framework for gender and the ways it had been impacting me my whole life. Feminism undid Catholicism for me way more than coming out did. I think I might have been able to reconcile being bisexual with being traditionally religious, but I could never figure out how to call something so integrated with patriarchy my religion. Now, in my new framework, men became less confusing and more problematic, especially straight men, especially frat boy types, and what the culture would now call bros. the stereotypical athletic sort kind of described in the reading earlier, the sort you might find with face paint on at a football stadium, or as the head of a large corporation like a bank or an oil company or a law firm. The sort who, when I look at my now almost 6 foot tall, almost 15-year-old son, suddenly appear to be much less like the enemy and more like our collective responsibility. Not to condemn, but to try to understand, and maybe even heal. Or to say it another way, I have taken multiple graduate and undergraduate level classes on gender, feminism, intersectionality, womanism, ecofeminism, and queer theory. I have even sat on a panel with one of the leading voices on gender, Kate Bornstein. And by the way, I am a religious professional in a tradition that offers lifespan education in gender and sexuality. I say all of this not to flex, but to confess. Because even though I have all of these tools and gender expertise, I am still stumbling my way through this question of what it means to be a man and to help my son become a man. Especially in ways not like the guy friends in theater, my guy friends in theater, or even like the boys on my math team and their now extremely lucrative jobs in programming today. Because Joseph has been telling us very clearly since he was a year old, that is not his path. My son is a football player, a weightlifter, a mountain biker. He likes video games and wears an Oregon Ducks hat and shirt basically every day. And sometimes he calls me bruh. And sometimes I let him. So what exactly is that in its best version? Some days I feel so unsure, I start to wonder if I really should have paused on that M checkbox after all. Now, it does help to know, however, that I'm not alone in this confusion. In the last few decades, sociology professor Michael Kimmel has led an entire academic degree program exploring this question of men and what it means to be a good man. Kimmel is at the forefront of the emerging field of men's studies, which is a direct counterpoint to the long-held idea that men don't have a gender, since being a man is just the default of what it means to be human. Like everybody else has gender, man's just a person, a human. The category of man, like the category of white or the category of straight, is just default. The word that needs no other words. Besides, why would you need to study men's history, for example, since isn't that just what we call history? This is what most people have tended to think until recent years, when people like Kimmel have started to realize that so much has now been considered about what it means to be something other than man. It has left a lot underexplored and unarticulated about this category, man, which in turn leaves unconscious assumptions about manhood intact, even reinforced, and keeps that cone of masculinity or of manhood narrow and very confining. In that important, insightful, and entirely troubling book, Boys and Sex, Peggy Orenstein shares that there appears to be a huge shift in how young men today perceive women. Most men today believe in gender equality in the classroom, in leadership, in athletics, and professional opportunities. They have many platonic friendships with women. Yet, as she says, when I asked them to describe the ideal boy, the ideal guy, these same boys who were coming of age in the 2000s appeared to be channeling in 1955. Their definition of masculinity had barely budged. Emotional detachment, rugged good looks with an emphasis on height, sexual prowess, athleticism, wealth, at least someday, dominance, aggression. A 2018 national survey of over 1,000 adolescents found that although girls believe that there were many ways to be a girl, the big honking caveat being that they still felt valued primarily for their appearance, boys felt that there was only one narrow pathway to successful manhood. They still equated the display of emotions, most emotions, as well as vulnerability, crying or appearing sensitive or moody, with acting like a girl, which, in case you were wondering, is not a good thing. Feminism may have afforded girls an escape from the constraints of conventional femininity, offered them alternative identities as women and a language with which to express their myriad of problems, but it has made few inroads with boys. Whether you label it the mask of masculinity, toxic masculinity, or the man box, the traditional conception of manhood still holds sway, dictating how boys think, feel, and behave. Now, one of the biggest surprises for me in parenting a boy, and therefore spending a lot of time with boys like him at different ages and stages, is just how tender-hearted and demonstrably loving boys can be. With each other and with their parents even, way more than my daughter and her friends were with each other or towards us. I confess, I didn't really know that about boys, particularly football-oriented boys. I didn't know they were so soft. In the cis boys and men that I've known, there's always been a few I described that way, but I thought they were just kind of the exceptions, or they were my gay friends. But I simply didn't know that this story that we've been told about boys' lack of emotionality and warmth was indeed a story, even for the ones that really, really like monster trucks. And I also have to say that as the group of kids in Joseph's peer group have gotten older, this softness has slowly and surely slipped away. In place of hugs, there are high fives and man nods. You know, hey. Hey. My son and his friends, these boys I've known since they were 5, they're now teenagers. Teenage boys. Boys who watch YouTube and play video games and spend at least some time every day in the locker room, where jokes and trash talk most likely seep with sexism and homophobia and racism, most often sanctioned by their coach or teacher. Increasingly in their world, they will learn, they have learned, they will keep learning that men must protect themselves and their identity as men above all else, even if it means they will sacrifice their humanity. Unitarian Universalist Minister Joanna Fontaine Crawford reminds us of the famous quote from Margaret Atwood that, quote, "Men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them." She says we usually pay attention in this quote to the disparity of the stakes men and women each face, being laughed at versus being killed. But what we forget to notice in this statement is that it reveals just how afraid men are of being humiliated. Men are taught that humiliation would be worse than death, which does help to explain why some young men seem to believe that picking up a semi-automatic weapon is a reasonable response when you're embarrassed. It also helps to explain why, in recent years, increasing numbers of men have found a home in what some call the manosphere. It builds on the ideas of the 1970s anti-feminist men's rights movement. The manosphere is a mostly white, straight male space filled with bloggers, influencers, and online forums, Reddit, dedicated to misogyny and the idea that white men are the ones who are actually oppressed. It includes people who still identify as men's rights activists, as well as a group now known as MGTOW, or I think I'm saying that right. It's MGTOW, men going their own way. That means those are men who believe women are so toxic they should just be avoided altogether. It also includes pickup artists, which, just like it sounds, it's a group focused on seduction techniques. And finally, incels, involuntary celibates, aka those men who believe they are entitled to sex with women but aren't getting it, and so therefore are mad at the women. They're involuntarily celibate. In the last decade, that manosphere, as with and not distinct from white nationalism, has moved from the fringes of society and culture to the mainstream. As just one example, the self-proclaimed misogynist and also recently arrested for sex trafficking, Andrew Tate, is currently one of the most well-known and even well-respected figures for tween and teen boys today, including, I promise you, for some of the boys you know and love. Some of the boys I know and love. Just try going to boys you know in your life, actually any teen or tween, and ask them if they know about Andrew Tate. See what happens. As middle school teacher Allison Oakes summarizes, Tate espouses horrifically misogynist views, but the problem is he also offers some pretty basic life skills that promote a healthy life. He talks about depression and vaping, even loneliness, things that young boys say they don't hear enough about. He then skillfully mixes in his own misogynistic and highly political views into this messaging. Oakes describes that in her classes, she's a middle school teacher, students would think that she would think would see through him, instead defend Tate. And a number, quote, seem almost obsessed with his Bugattis, his money and fame, and the outlandish things he says. They say things like, quote, I don't agree with his sexist comments, but he defends us men. Or, no one is taking care of our mental health, and he does. Or, he told us not to vape, see, he's a good guy. When we leave man out of our gender conversation, except as an object for critique, then young men go looking for a way to make sense of the world and their place in it. So it makes sense. They would turn to a framework that would offer something constructive and cohesive to address their experience. As journalist Clint Edwards writes, Tate gives young men a lens through which to view the world and even rules to live by. Being a mom to my son over the last 15 years has challenged how I think about manhood and masculinity. Challenged me first to redirect that anger that I have had for much of my life about behaviors that for much of my life I've had to struggle against or heal from. Instead of being angry at men, I realize really I'm just angry at the cone of masculinity and manhood itself and the ways that we are all caught and hurt by it. All of us. Not because it can apparently include a love of monster trucks or trains or even football, which it turns out I kind of love too. But because somehow the toughness of these things imply that the cone doesn't also include tenderness and tears or any sort of vulnerability. Even though Brené Brown has repeatedly reminded us that vulnerability is the birthplace of strength and courage. I've also realized that a more helpful posture than confusion about men would be a posture of curiosity. At the start of the series, Sean asked us to get curious about the gender of each person we meet, whatever their surface appearance seems to indicate, to make space for more diversity than is immediately apparent or even overtly claimed. This is a practice I believe is especially needed for our cis-surfaced men. We need to take a deep breath and get curious about cis men in all and as much ways as we are curious about other gender expressions. We need to interrogate our own assumptions, the ones baked in, the still caught in the 1950s notions that even we have about what it means to be a man. We need to make space for softness and struggle, even if it had to go dormant in order for the man to survive. My guess is that this need for curiosity is especially true if you are yourself a cis man, because it is the water you swim in and have for your whole life, which means it's impossible to fully see without intention and help. This curiosity can help us make the space, as Catherine Bon Stockton encouraged, between word and object, between man and the person called a man. Holding in this space, we make possible a world where men are no longer required to sacrifice their personhood for manhood. Because man, we know, can never really touch the person. There will always be distance, space, breath. And in this space, there can also be creativity, imagination, and love. In this space, there is God. May it be so, and amen.